Hi children, it's Grandma Carla with more of Freddy Goes to Florida. This is chapter 13. Now, after the adventure with the alligators, the animals rested for 2 days, and then they went on seeing the sights of Florida. They made a great many pleasant friends among the natives, and even Mr. and Mrs. Webb made the acquaintance of a number of very interesting and agreeable spiders with whom they discussed fly catching and compared notes on weaving and other matters of interest. But at last one morning, when they awoke, the sky was full of flocks of birds. Bluebirds and blackbirds and redbirds and yellowhammers and purple grackles, all flying steadily northward. And then they knew that spring had come, and it was time for them to be starting back home. "Well, I, for one, shall be glad to get back," said Mrs. Wiggins. "We've had a grand time traveling, but home is a pretty good place. The snow is all gone by this time, I expect, and Mr. Bean is getting ready to plant his potatoes and corn and cabbages. And the old elm by the barn is all covered with buds," said Charles. "And the ice has gone out of the duck pond," said Alice and Emma. "And Mr. Bean will need me to help with the spring plowing," said Hank. "Come along, animals," said Freddy. "Let's start." And so they said goodbye to Florida and started home. They had been traveling for about a week when they came one morning to a big field, which was all heaped with tin cans and old shoes and ashes and rubbish of all kinds. There were prickly thistles growing in the field, and a goat was eating them. "Good morning, goat," said Freddy. "Good morning, pig," said the goat. "Have a thistle? They're delicious." "No, thanks," said Freddy. "Have you ever eaten one?" asked the goat. "No," said Freddy. "They never looked very good to me." "You'd be surprised," said the goat, "how tasty they are. Just take a nip of this big one here." Freddy didn't want to try the thistle, but he was always very polite and didn't like to hurt the goat's feelings, and so he took a large bite. As soon as he had taken the bite, he wished that he hadn't. The prickles tickled his mouth horribly and stuck into his tongue, and he coughed and sneezed and squeezed and grunted and ran around and around in circles while the other animals laughed, and the goat looked at him in surprise. And at last, he got it out of his mouth. "I'm very sorry," said the goat. "Perhaps there was something the matter with that one. Now here's a nice one. Or perhaps you'd rather have a bit of old boot. There were 2 fine ones left here yesterday. I've eaten one, but—" "No, thank you," said Freddy firmly. "Some people say a pig will eat anything, but really, one must draw the line somewhere, and I draw it at old boots." "Well, well," said the goat with a sigh, "there's no accounting for taste. I hope that I might perhaps persuade you animals to settle down and live here with me. But of course, if you don't like thistles or boots—" "We don't," said Mrs. Wiggins, "any of us." "Then that settles it," said the goat sorrowfully, "because there's really nothing else here. I like it, but it's very lonesome. No one to talk to all day long but the stupid cart horses who bring the rubbish here to be dumped. And I do like good conversation." He was so lonely that the animals spent the rest of the day with him and told him of their travels. Just as they were leaving, late in the afternoon, a farm wagon came along, piled high with rubbish. It belonged to a man who was moving into another house, and he brought all of the stuff that he didn't want to keep. He was going to throw it on the old dump heap. On the very top of the load was a funny, old-fashioned carriage. The man threw the rubbish out of the wagon, carriage and all, and drove away. "Must be some boots in that lot," said the goat, licking his lips, and began poking around in the heap. But Jinx and Freddy had walked over and were looking at the funny old-fashioned carriage. They talked together in undertones for a few minutes, and then Jinx said, "Hey, Hank, come here. Do you suppose that you could draw this carriage?" "Draw that?" said Hank indignantly. "I've drawn heavier wagons than that many the time." "Oh, I know you can draw it," said Jinx. "What I mean is, can you draw it the way it is without any harness and straps and things?" "Well, no," said Hank. "I'd have to have a collar and traces and a bridle and a bit and a shirringle and—" "Oh, we don't know what any of those things are," said Jinx, "and anyway, we haven't got them. But there's an old piece of rope. Suppose we could tie that to the handles of the carriage and put it over your shoulders. Could you draw it then?" "Why, I won't say I couldn't," said Hank. But what do you want the carriage for anyway? If you can draw it, said Jinx, we can put the gold that we found in the aunt's house in it and take it back to Mr. Bean. Hank thought that this was a fine plan, so Freddy got the rope and Jinx tied it to the handles of the carriage. All cats are good at tying knots. The stupidest cat can tie 40 knots in a ball of yarn in 2 minutes. And if you don't believe it, ask your grandmother. So this was easy for Jinx. And they had hope. And then they looped the rope over Hank's shoulders and he pulled the carriage up onto the road. The carriage had 2 seats and the top was like a square umbrella with fringe around the edges. It was called a Phaeton. And if you think that it is a funny name, all I can say is that it's a very funny carriage. The animals laughed like anything when they saw Hank pulling it out of the dump heap, and Mrs. Wiggins laughed so hard that she had to lie down right in the middle of all of the old tin cans. But when Freddy told them what they could use it for and how they could carry the gold back to Mr. Bean in it, they were very much pleased. The 2 dogs gathered together a number of things that they thought that Mr. Bean would like and put them in the carriage. There was an old straw hat and an old overcoat and 2 pails, 1/2 full of red paint and 1/2 full of green paint. And he can use them to paint the house, said Robert. And there was an old plaid shawl for Mrs. Bean. These were all things that people had thrown away on the dump heap, but the animals thought Mr. Bean could use them. And if he didn't use them, he could throw them away and nobody's feelings would be hurt. Then they said goodbye to the goat. He didn't feel so bad about their going now because he had a fresh wagon load of rubbish to look over and had already found a lot more old boots to chew on. Then all of the small animals climbed onto the Phaeton and they started off. Robert and Emma and Jack sat on the front seat and Freddy and Alice and Jinx and Henrietta sat on the back seat. The 4 mice played tag all over the carriage for a while, and then they curled up on the bottom and went to sleep. And Charles perched on top of the square umbrella. When they had gone a little way, they looked back and waved goodbye to the goat, and he waved back at them. They could see him chewing contentedly, and the ends of the old shoestrings were hanging out of both sides of his mouth. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.